Hey there, welcome to LSAT Demon Daily. I'm Nathan Fox, that's Ben Olson. We're the founders of LSATdemon.com and our weekly podcast, Thinking LSAT. We've got an email here from Jeff. The subject is correlation causation versus sufficient necessary flaws.
Hi, Demon Team. I was wondering if you could explain the difference between correlation causation flaws and sufficient necessary flaws. It's like whenever a question has both in the answer choices, I always seem to choose the other from what it is. Okay. Well, I will tell you that not only are these two flaws some of the most common flaws on the LSAT, they're also some of the most common wrong answer choices given on the LSAT because they know that, this is something that comes up a lot. So,
Yep.
I'm not surprised you're encountering questions that have both of these answer choices in the wrong answers. I guess
Here's a similar argument. I'll read you the similar argument, Ben, and you can tell me what you think of it.
Okay.
People who exercise regularly are about 50% less likely to suffer from depression compared to those who don't. So if you want to avoid depression, you should exercise regularly. What error is that?
Yeah. So that's a correlation to causation flaw.
Right. Where it's like it could be the case that exercise prevents depression, but it doesn't have to be the case because, for one thing, it could be the other way around, that if you are depressed, you don't exercise. And if you weren't depressed, you already would be exercising. So the fact that people who exercise regularly are less likely to suffer from depression just might mean that if you're depressed, you don't want to exercise.
Yeah. Yep.
And it could be that if you just start exercising, that's not going to cure your depression at all, because the lack of exercise could be an effect of the depression, not causing the depression. So this is obviously the correlation, therefore causation error, not the confusing sufficient for necessary error.
Yeah.
The confusing sufficient for necessary is always just obviously stupid.
So what happened here, right? Jeff says, I chose the correct answer, but the explanation highlights the flaw as a correlation causation flaw. And I went into thinking about it as a necessary sufficient flaw. And I think that's just because Jeff is wildly oversimplifying this and saying, hey, the conclusion says if.
Right. Yeah. Jeff, the sufficient necessary flaw, when I said it's obviously stupid, the sufficient necessary flaw sounds like if you're at Fenway Park, you are in Boston. Joe is in Boston, therefore Joe is at Fenway Park. You should hear that and go, even if I grant you that Fenway Park is in Boston and anyone at Fenway Park has to be in Boston, that does not mean that anybody who's in Boston has to be at Fenway Park. That's just like plainly stupid. And it's confusing the if and the then. And I get how the given argument about depression and exercise, you could, reversal of cause and effect is a potential like trick there. And I can see how there's something similar. But it's just not confusing sufficient for necessary. Let me give you another example. If you're speaking English, then you're speaking a language. Mary is speaking a language, therefore Mary is speaking English. That's not correlation causation because I never even cited a correlation. Correlation causation is when I cite two things that are associated with one another. Here, depression and lack of exercise, or exercise and lack of depression. Then I claim that one thing causes the other, when it's possible that some third thing causes the other, or it's possible that the stated relationship could be backward. But that's very different from confusing sufficient and necessary. What do you think we need here to make this click for Jeff?
Well, I think the main problem here is that the premise in this argument, people who exercise regularly are about 50% less likely to suffer from depression compared to those who don't. When Jeff read a similar claim, Jeff thought, oh, this is a causal claim. A causes B. But all we know is that these two things happen together. And so if you think that A causes B and then you read the conclusion and it has an if then statement and it sounds like, oh, hey, if you want to avoid B, you should exercise regularly or something. Jeff is just really kind of missing the
Yeah.
bigger picture here, which is that the first sentence doesn't even have a sort of necessary, sufficient relationship, let alone a cause and effect relationship.
But also, if it did, then I don't think that the conclusion would actually be false. I mean,
if
if
it
they
did,
had
yeah,
said,
it wouldn't be flawed. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
if they said, if you exercise regularly, you give yourself a 50%, like you reduce your chances, like if you exercise regularly, you cut your own personal incidence of depression by 50%, something like
Yeah.
that. If it
Yeah.
gave you a fact where it was like, no, oh, this is how it works.
There's
If
a
you do
causal
this,
relationship.
then you will do that.
Yeah.
Well, then this conclusion, if you want to avoid depression, you should exercise regularly, might not even be flawed.
Yeah, it wouldn't violate first of all, there wouldn't be any correlation. So that we wouldn't have a correlation causation flaw. And then it would be a sound argument, let alone not even raising the specter of like sufficient versus necessary. Yeah.
Right. So maybe Jeff needs to get clearer about what the sufficient necessary error is in the first place.
Yes.
Maybe Jeff also needs to just realize that the correlation causation error is always going to cite a correlation and then just conclude that one thing causes the other.
Now, well, and to be clear here, this conclusion is based on the assumption that there is a causal relationship between those two things. Because the conclusion didn't literally say, hey, exercising regularly causes you to,
No.
avoid depression. It said, if you want to avoid depression, you should exercise regularly. The underlying assumption there is a causal claim. So that's
when
why
all
this
they
is
cited was a statistical claim about association, which
the
is
correlation.
the people who do exercise have about a 50% less likelihood of depression than the people who don't exercise. That's a fact. That's an observed fact about the world. But we don't know that there's actually causation there. They just assume that there's causation in their conclusion.
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest problem with the correlation causation flaw is that people are really, really bad at recognizing correlative claims. They read correlative claims and they
immediately think
think
it's causal.
Causal. And it saved your ancestors from tigers in the bush. Because when they saw a correlation between the grass moving and tigers jumping out, the idiots who said, well, just because those things happen together doesn't mean that there's going to be a tiger there, got fucked. But so, yeah, we have a natural tendency to
see
imagine, causation where it might not necessarily exist, but it's better to assume that it does so that you don't get screwed. But the test is trying to say, hey, there is a difference between correlative claims and causal claims. And in fact, the vast majority of studies in the world can simply just assert correlation. And then we just have to kind of infer or suspect that there's likely a causal relationship there because we've ruled out the other possibilities.
Sounds good. Hope that was helpful for Jeff.
Yeah, I would say, one last thing. When you read a sentence, look very carefully at whether it is telling you why something is happening versus just that it is happening. So in this sentence, when it says people who exercise regularly are about 50% less likely to suffer from depression. Okay, that's telling me what the situation is. It's not telling me why that is the situation.
So it changes the game if they say, because exercise releases endorphins and endorphins protect against depression, now they're actually making the causal claim. They're actually telling you, this is not just a correlation, this is actually causation. But what this example stopped at was just people who exercise regularly are 50% less likely to suffer from depression. And that's just that. All that is just here's an observed fact from the world. Don't know why this happens, but then they conclude that one thing causes the other, or they assume that one thing causes the other when they reach their conclusion.
Yeah. And to be clear, when I say the test isn't telling us why that is the case, we don't need an extra premise to say why. When a causal claim is made, it's actually baked into the sentence. So they would say something like, exercise reduces your depression. Then all of a sudden, you know why the depression is going down. Oh, it's going down because of exercise. Right now, though, we don't know why it's down. We just know that it is down.
Yeah. Among the people who exercise, there is less depression, but we don't know why at all.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Wrap it up there.
Yeah. Email daily@lsatdemon.com if you'd like to ask us a question or share some LSAT or law school admissions news. Thanks for listening.